Good morning. From time to time, we cover issues that we know are causing a lot of problems for important people in important places around the world, almost no matter where you live, or what your political beliefs are, or who you want to win in a particular conflict. And today is one of those days. The Wall Street Journal has been doing some strong columns for over a year about how Chinese drones are outperforming drones made by US companies. This is happening among our own allies, armies that rely on US and NATO for equipment and weaponry. Silicon Valley is where most of our drone technology is developed and tested, and our makers cannot keep up with the changing battlefield demands of combat users. And so these users are turning to low cost and much more effective Chinese-made equipment. If we remember the early days of the war in the Ukraine, Ukrainian forces began using US and Western produced drones. And these were very successful in blunting the strike power of the Russian advance. Eventually, though, the Russians adapted and Ukraine became a war of attrition rather than a war of maneuver. And this is what's catching most of the headlines now. The attrition, the grinding nature of the war there now. But the Wall Street Journal published a piece last February 2023, which gives a lot more insight to what is happening on the ground and why. In the opening paragraph, Ukraine has repurposed cheap commercial drones for use on the battlefield. So skilled technicians can make modifications to them cheaply and fast. That's what jury-rigged means, and deploy them in combat. The journal also explains how these drones are being used to improve battlefield artillery in real time. Here are two strategic insights. Drones, a quote, drones let poor countries do stuff that only rich countries could do in the past. Drones are also important from the aspect of psychological warfare. It's comforting to be a trooper on the ground and know that you have a friendly drone watching the area around you. And it's not comforting at all to see an enemy drone come from the other side and watch what you're doing. So drones allow for freedom of movement, or drones can deny freedom of movement. In the Ukraine, ordinary citizens are buying the Chinese-made drones and turning them over to the military to use. And this is problematic for companies that want to restrict their use to civilian applications only. It's not the militaries here who are buying them, but regular people. Then they hand it over to guys who know how to turn them into cheap but very effective weapons. And in the Ukraine, there are 18,000 people now devoted to this very thing, buying drones, getting them to the Ukraine, where they are then equipped for combat use. And most of the drones they're buying are coming from a Chinese company, DJI technology from Shenzhen. Here they show how DJI, the Chinese company, was supplying the Russians with the ability to detect their drones, but the Ukrainians found out about it and they designed a device, they call it Olga, so that the Russian systems could not find them. All those stories came from last February. In November came another Wall Street Journal piece dated November 9. It explains how Israel also wants drones. Don't care where they're coming from, for use in operations by the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. And just as in the Ukraine, it is civilians who are buying the technology. Here it says the Chinese drones are purchased in the US and sent to Israel. This guy, Bobby Sakaki, says when you're fighting, you don't care about politics, you care about survival, about victory. And in the case of Israel, how the IDF procured the Chinese-built drones is the same as how the Ukrainians are doing it. They're buying them off the shelf. That means from a store, shipping them to Israel. Once there, the Israeli techs get busy turning them into weapons. And this causes problems for the Chinese drone manufacturers who say here, just like in the Ukraine, that they have nothing to do with the shipments to Israel or for their use in warfare. Yesterday's Wall Street Journal was even more pointed and critical of US drone makers. It's bad enough that the Chinese drones are working more effectively and at lower cost, and that they can be bought at a toy store and repurchased for combat operations. But what we see here is that the US drones aren't working at all. This is also bad news for the Pentagon, who needs to buy lots of them, bad for our troops on the ground, bad for troops from friendly countries who depend on our US-built drones to support them. For the drones we're shipping over for use in Ukraine, for, quote, for every class of US drone, they don't work as well as drones from other systems. This is not a Chinese drone salesman saying this. This is the CEO of the Silicon Valley company with the contract to build the drones for the Ukraine. This is what the CEO is saying publicly. Ukraine thinks US-built drones are fragile. They cannot overcome Russian jamming and GPS countermeasures. They often can't take off, can't perform the mission, can't come back. They often can't fly as far as they're supposed to, or they can't carry enough weight. American drone company insiders say they did not expect electronic warfare. I suppose this means they thought the Russians weren't going to try to figure out how to use electronic warfare to stop drones from killing their soldiers and blowing up their equipment in the field. That's what this implies. It's saying that the executives of companies that build weapons for the Pentagon and for warfighters around the world actually expected that the other side wouldn't react. They were just going to roll over. That's what they thought, and they didn't just think so. They didn't just say this among themselves. They actually said so to a Wall Street Journal reporter. And it's times like this when I wonder whether they have a veteran or two on their payroll to inject some real-world advice and experience, wisdom. What would a veteran tell them about that? About being surprised that the Russians of all people, figured out pretty quickly how to beat our drones. It's no plan survives first contact with the enemy. In the Army, you learn that the first day. You can surprise them once. Put to the field a novel technology or a new fighting doctrine, and you will surprise them. You can knock them off balance and seize the advantage for a month. You might have a good month while they figure out what to do, how to respond. But if they're Russian, you probably won't get that long. Those are the people, after all, who do win all the chess tournaments. And so now the people who designed the drones that worked so well 2 years ago are learning that we need new and better ones. They don't know how to build them. And the Ukraine has learned that too. The Ukrainian troops are instead using drones built by the Chinese companies DJI. And DJI doesn't want their drones used in the war or in any war. Here is another quote from them saying so. And the US companies who do want to build the weapons that are combat ready and are actually effective, they're quoted as saying that they can't do the job. A lot of questions regarding this come to mind right away. Some of them are obvious, but let's look instead at some of the ones that aren't so obvious, which are even more disturbing. Like, if the civilian drones built by China are assumed to be the best in class by warfighters in the field, how much better are the drones that are used by the Chinese military itself? That's to say, if a private Chinese company's drones that are being sold at Toys R Us or Walmart, if those are good enough to take on Russian mechanized formations, and they're being used by the IDF to look inside Gaza and who knows where else, how good are the drones being used by the actual Chinese military? The Chinese regular army, the Chinese infantry? How much better are their military drones compared to the ones being made for civilian uses? For photographers and kids using drones for fun, those are good enough to take on some of the best armies in the world. What are the military ones good for? And if this is true of the Chinese drones, what other weapon systems are they building at low cost with very high degrees of reliability and accuracy? And don't forget that thing about the Russian GPS, how they jammed and switched off Ukrainians' use of GPS to foil their missions for US-made drones. How did they do that? And if the Russians can do it, is there anyone else who can? And if the GPS can be hacked and turned off, can they also be hacked to have a friendly unit show up as an enemy one? Can our satellite navigation on these drones be hacked so that one of our own drones is told to bomb a friendly target, our own people? Could the Russians do that? Could the Chinese do that? Are we certain that they cannot do that? It says in the article that the drones got lost. That's bad enough if they just crash in a field somewhere. But I want to know, how can something with GPS be lost? Are you sure it was lost? Or is it possible that somebody hacked it and took it themselves? Are we certain that did not happen? If the industry insiders, the people who design these drones for a living, for use on the battlefield, if they say in public to the Wall Street Journal that we are having all these problems, what are they saying privately? What are the discussions between them and battlefield commanders? How bad are things really that they're embarrassed to say publicly? If a Ukrainian soldier in the field, or an IDF, an Israeli soldier in the field, looks up and sees a US-made drone, his first thought is that it doesn't work very well. It's not going to do the job. It might even crash on top of my head. And if he goes to the Wall Street Journal and reads page 3, he'll learn that even the American company that built the thing is still trying to work the bugs out. The next day he looks up and sees a Chinese drone. It was bought from Sam's Club, tweaked a bit, and he knows that thing is better and more reliable than the US one that he saw yesterday. The Chinese drone will do the job he needs it to do, and that the Chinese company that built the drone doesn't even want the thing to be there. Strange world, but that's the one we're living in. Be good.